Today for StarCraft 2 history, I'm going to have a focus on Jinro. And Jinro, for those who don't know, was a Swedish Terran who played in the early parts of StarCraft 2 history, specifically from 2010 to 2011. And his peak actually doesn't last very long, about 3 months in the end of 2010 to the very beginning of 2011. But he's an important character in terms of the meta, in terms of what he represented, and in terms of what he did. So, when talking about Jinro, the first thing you have to point out is that he was a forward thinker and way back in the early days of StarCraft 2. Back then, in order to lay it out, a lot of people rightly believed that you should be focusing on one base and two base builds, and this is shown a lot in their play. And there are various reasons for that. First is it's easier to master a one or two base build early on, as the games go faster, so you play more games, so you can figure out the iterations and the branches and the decisions you make off of those one to two base builds. On top of that, the maps themselves kind of favor this. Like I said in one of the previous videos, the maps were complete shit during the early parts of StarCraft 2, and it made it very hard to get a third base naturally. And this is where Jinro comes in, because Jinro had a very different philosophy where he believed that you should be playing the macro style game of at least getting the three bases, and then off of the economy you build up a stronger army, and hence a stronger army composition. Like, 10 Marines is greater than 8 Marines, but in a more serious sense, it's more he had ideas about how to beat Terran, about how to beat Protoss, how to beat Zerg if you were able to get that economy rolling, and that's kind of his big contribution to the early parts of the StarCraft 2 meta, because he made people realize that it wasn't impossible to do. And in a sense, he was the first Terran player to really do this. And he along with Marine King really changed the way Terrans thought about that race. And both of the ways each of those players brought to the race was taken in a sense by MVP and improved upon by MVP. So I don't actually know what MVP looks like without Jinro in a sense, because he's able to take these builds that he's able to take this idea that Jinro has, because Jinro as a player, he was a little bit obsessed with cute openings. And what I mean by cute openings is they were non-orthodox, they weren't easy to read, they had a very specific purpose in mind for each one, and it wasn't very if you kept playing them over and over and over again, eventually the player who was playing against it will figure it out and be able to punish it in a sense. So they weren't really solid builds, but they were smart builds, they were cute builds, they were very specific types of builds. And obviously I think Rhett actually criticized him a little bit for this, in that he was thinking too much instead of focusing on the solid fundamentals of his play, at least when we go on later into Jinro's career. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because obviously there's a difference between the way Jinro was playing and then the way it iterated into MVP's prism of how he viewed the game. But Jinro is definitely the first. And on top of that, he was the first foreigner and the only foreigner to ever get to the semifinals of a GSL. He did it in the GSL Open Season 3, and then he did it again in GSL January 2011. And both times he ran into two of the best players of the early era of StarCraft 2, Marine King and MC respectively. Or actually MC and Marine King respectively. And both of them were players that he had apparently played against, he had practiced against, and he had realized that on some level they were better than him. And so I forget where the interview is, but he definitely said at some point he believed that the reason he lost those semifinals was that he was satisfied. And that is an important critical point to take away from Jinro's career, was even though he got to the semifinals, he was satisfied, but you can never truly be satisfied until you win. And that is the competitive edge, that is the winning mentality that you need in order to become the best. And to be fair to Jinro, Marine King and MC should have been big favorites against him, but the problem with Jinro's runs in both of those semifinals was he didn't really put up much of a fight against either of them, and it gets even worse when you go into like GSL March 2011 where he plays MC again, and he comes out with a build that MC didn't see coming. It was like this mech build on Scrap Station, and it really makes you wonder if Jinro had that mindset, if he had that winner's mentality, would he have put up a better fight? I don't know if he could have won, but he would definitely put up a better fight in my opinion. And on top of that, so Jinro, on top of that, he also won the MLG Dallas before both of those GSL runs against CT1. As a player, Jinro became ridiculously popular, obviously because he was the foreigner, so he was like the foreigner hope against the Korean might, so to speak. Like he, along with Idra, played around the same time, though Idra kept going, whereas Jinro fell off. And another reason I think Jinro was highly popular was because of the types of games he played, where a lot of his games in the early days of StarCraft 2 were longer games, but they were all entertaining. Like his game against TT1 in the Dallas finals, that was a shit map. I forget what it was, but it's that weird map with the desert tile. I guess I can check. But basically, they split the map, even though that map shouldn't have been able to be split. Blistering Sands, I think that's what it was called. And they split the map, and then Jinro goes into this high macro style where he's bombing TT1 with nukes and then using that to create openings into TT1's like area of the map to eventually take the game. And he did this against, and then on the reverse side, when he split the map against like Ensnare, which was one of the better TVTs early on in that era, and they were both teammates. Ensnare kind of ran into nukes, but Jinro was able to counter him with better map movement, better understanding of the economy in a sense. I don't know if it was an intuitive understanding or an actual understanding, or maybe he just really didn't want to go build a bunch of nuke academies, but he understood that you can't really waste nukes on turrets unless you're actually getting something with it from it. And that wasn't something like Ensnare kind of realized. It just kind of kept sending out nukes and then it didn't help really. And so Jinro just outlasts him in that game, even though it's like a very back and forth game where there's a lot of attacking, and goes all the way to the end. And Jinro was one of the few players to have tried his hand at mech and, like I pointed out, succeeded against MC. And Jinro is, in a sense, what we stereotype the early types of players as. So he was a player who had a better understanding of the game early on. He used that understanding and parlayed it into a specific style, some specific builds that gave him early on success. But as time went on, his other players have caught up to his innovations, and he, as a player, in terms of skill, couldn't match up to the rest of them later on. But as a player, even though that the peak is that 3-month peak is very short, if we're just talking about relative to the rest of the field, he's arguably one of the best foreigners we've ever seen. Both semifinal runs to the GSL are pretty legendary, though I personally think the Naniwa runs or the Huck runs are more impressive, just because they happen in a later time scale where there's stronger players relative to the understanding of the game. And so he's definitely right up there. I think he actually made my top 15 list, and he could have, depending on the criteria, you could have bumped him up a lot, just because if we're just talking about pure peak, he was amongst the highest, definitely higher than almost everybody on that list, except for like the top 4, basically. Stefano, Naniwa, Huck, Snoot. Though I put Snoot in third and Huck in fourth. I'll talk about that eventually when it comes up. And then there's arguments to be made about him against Scarlet or him against a few of the others. But Jinro is definitely one of the best foreigners, and he inspired a lot of hope, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how you would explain it, but there was a definite undercurrent of belief back in the early parts of StarCraft 2 where people still believed that on some level foreigners could still compete, and that it would be more like Warcraft 3 than Brood War. As it turned out to be more like Brood War than Warcraft 3. But yeah, Jinro was definitely a great player. And then after he retired, he eventually went back, I think, to poker, and he eventually became an MMA fighter. So that's pretty interesting. Not exactly sure what he's done since, but every once in a while he'll poke back into StarCraft 2, watch some games, and talk about it in his blog. So look it up. It's on the Team Liquid blogs under his Jinro, I believe, still. Pretty interesting insight, and he's also one of the guys who's pretty open about stuff that happened back in the days during StarCraft 2 or his own thoughts about StarCraft 2 in general. So that's Jinro in a nutshell. One of the best foreigner Terrans in the early on. An innovator in terms of the meta of StarCraft 2 and his style. And even though his career was short, his career peak was short, his style moved on. And as for the last part, even though the rest of his career isn't glamorous at all, it's pretty mediocre or below average, I've always respected Jinro for the fact that he never took the easy route. And what I mean by that is there were multiple times in GSL history where he was offered the foreigner seed because GSL like wanted like a foreigner in the code S, and if they couldn't get anybody, they would try. Sometimes they offered a Jinro, and Jinro always refused because Jinro believed that competition was what mattered the most, and if he wasn't good enough to get there by himself, that he didn't deserve the seat anyway. And so I always respected Jinro for that. I've always thought he was legit in that sense. All right, so that's it for the Jinro spiel, and I'll see you guys later.